Officer Marcus Chen's hands trembled slightly as he gripped Shadow's leash, the leather worn smooth from years of handling. The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floor of the federal courthouse's entrance, and Marcus could feel his heart pounding against his ribs like a trapped bird desperate for escape. Shadow, his 7-year-old German Shepherd partner, sensed the anxiety radiating from his handler and pressed his muscular body against Marcus's leg reassuringly. The gesture was familiar. Shadow had learned years ago that when Marcus was anxious, the dog's steady presence could ground him. But today, even Shadow's unwavering loyalty couldn't calm the storm brewing inside Marcus's mind. The courthouse steps were crowded with photographers, journalists, and news vans with their satellite dishes pointed skyward like mechanical flowers seeking sunlight. This wasn't just another day in court. This was the trial of Derek Vance, a man responsible for the brutal murders of 7 women across 3 states over the course of 3 years. Vance had evaded law enforcement for nearly 36 months, leaving detectives baffled and terrified families devastated. The media had dubbed him the Ghost because he'd managed to vanish like smoke after each killing, leaving behind almost no physical evidence. Almost. But Shadow had found him. 3 months ago, during a routine tracking exercise in the woods outside Portland, Shadow had detected a scent signature that matched DNA evidence from one of Vance's crime scenes. The breakthrough had led to Vance's arrest, and now, finally, to this moment, the trial that would determine whether justice would prevail. As Marcus and Shadow approached the courthouse doors, federal marshals saluted respectfully. They knew Shadow's reputation. The dog had solved 19 cases in his career, located 17 missing persons, and had an almost supernatural ability to track criminals across impossible terrain. Shadow's photograph hung in the K9 Unit's Hall of Fame, positioned prominently among legendary dogs who'd served with distinction. But there was something different about Shadow, something that even the most experienced handlers couldn't quite articulate. It was as if the dog possessed an almost mystical connection to danger, an ability to sense threats that existed beyond the realm of normal canine perception. Marcus led Shadow through the metal detectors, watching as security officers nodded knowingly. They'd been briefed about Shadow's presence and the critical role he would play in the prosecution's case. Shadow would be witness, evidence, and living testament to the power of law enforcement partnerships. The courthouse gallery was packed to capacity. Reporters from every major news network occupied the front rows, their cameras and recording devices creating a forest of technology. Behind them sat the families of Vance's victims, their faces etched with hope mixed with the haunting pain of loss. They believed that today, finally, they would see justice served. They believed that Shadow's testimony, presented through Marcus's expertise, would seal Derek Vance's fate once and for all. Judge Patricia Holloway presided over the case with an iron will. She was known throughout the federal court system as a woman who tolerated no nonsense, no delays, no excuses. Her reputation preceded her, 30 years on the bench, an impeccable record of convictions upheld on appeal, and a courtroom demeanor that commanded absolute respect. When she glanced at Marcus and Shadow as they took their positions near the evidence area, her expression was stern but not unkind. She acknowledged them with a slight nod, a gesture that conveyed both recognition and warning. This courtroom was her domain, and everything that happened within these walls fell under her absolute authority. But Marcus harbored a secret that gnawed at him like a persistent infection spreading through his thoughts. For the past week, 7 days that felt like 70, Shadow had been exhibiting strange and deeply troubling behavior. It started subtly. Shadow would suddenly perk up his ears during their routine morning walk, responding to sounds that Marcus couldn't hear. The dog would become restless during nights that were supposed to be calm, packing back and forth across the apartment like a prisoner in a cell. More alarming was Shadow's complete lack of interest in food. Shadow's favorite meal, premium beef kibble mixed with chicken and sweet potato, sat untouched in his bowl for hours. The dog, who normally devoured his meals with enthusiastic urgency, was suddenly refusing nourishment. Marcus had rushed Shadow to the veterinary clinic twice, terrified that his partner was suffering from some serious illness or injury. Dr. Patricia Morrison, the veterinarian who'd been caring for Shadow since the dog's recruitment into the K9 unit, had conducted a thorough examination. She'd checked Shadow's temperature, examined his ears, eyes, and teeth, palpated his abdomen, and even run blood tests. Everything came back normal. Shadow's vitals were excellent. His blood work revealed no infections, no deficiencies, no physiological abnormalities. Shadow is in perfect health, Dr. Morrison had concluded, her brow furrowed with puzzlement. Whatever's going on, it's not medical, it's behavioral. It's like he's responding to something we can't see or hear. Those words echoed in Marcus's mind now as he settled into position in the courtroom. Something we can't see or hear. What if Shadow knew something that Marcus didn't? What if the dog's instincts were picking up on a threat that existed in the vicinity? Shadow had been trained extensively in explosive detection during his first years of service before being reassigned to tracking and evidence work. Could residual training be activating? Could Shadow be detecting something hidden, something dangerous, somewhere within the courthouse itself? The gallery filled with people. Spectators took their seats. The courthouse bailiff called for order. Derek Vance was led into the courtroom by federal marshals, his orange prison jumpsuit a stark contrast to his pale, angular features. His eyes, cold and devoid of remorse, scanned the courtroom with unsettling intelligence. When his gaze landed on Shadow, something flickered in his expression, a micro-expression of recognition or perhaps fear. Marcus felt his muscles tense. Shadow remained composed, lying at Marcus's feet with apparent calm. But Marcus could feel the tension in the leash, the subtle vibration running through the dog's body like an electric current waiting to be released. Something was wrong. Something about this courtroom, this moment, this man. Shadow knew something that was about to explode into chaos. As Judge Holloway prepared to call the trial to order, Marcus glanced down at his partner and noticed something that made his blood run cold. Shadow's nose was twitching with rapid, deliberate movements. His nostrils flared repeatedly, as if processing scents that had triggered every alert instinct the dog possessed. Shadow's eyes remained fixed on Derek Vance with an intensity that transcended normal canine observation. It was as if Shadow could see directly into the man's soul, detecting not just physical evidence but something far more sinister. The prosecutor stood, preparing to present the opening statement. The gallery fell silent in anticipation. Judge Holloway's gavel hovered above her desk, ready to officially commence the proceedings that would determine Derek Vance's future. And in that moment, as everyone waited for the machinery of justice to begin its solemn work, Marcus felt Shadow shift beneath his hand. The dog's entire body was vibrating now, every muscle coiled and ready, as if standing on the precipice of an explosion that only Shadow could anticipate. Marcus squeezed the leash tighter, silently commanding his partner to remain calm. But deep in his bones, he knew that Shadow was about to do something extraordinary, something that would change the course of this trial forever. Whatever Shadow sensed, whatever that restless behavior of the past week had been preparing him for, was about to manifest in a moment that would echo through the federal courthouse and beyond. The trial was about to begin, but neither Marcus nor anyone else in that courtroom had any idea just how dramatically everything was about to change. The prosecutor, Assistant U.S. Attorney James Richardson, stood with deliberate confidence, his tailored suit impeccable, his demeanor radiating the authority of someone who'd successfully prosecuted hundreds of cases. He adjusted his tie and began walking toward the jury box, his opening statement carefully rehearsed over countless hours of preparation. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of someone accustomed to commanding attention in courtrooms. "The evidence you will hear over the coming weeks will paint a portrait of depravity and calculated murder. Derek Vance is a predator who methodically hunted innocent women, And today, with the help of modern forensic science and one extraordinary law enforcement partner, we will prove his guilt beyond any reasonable doubt. The jury members leaned forward, engaged and attentive. This was the moment they'd been waiting for, the moment when the abstract became concrete, when allegations transformed into narrative, when justice began its deliberate march toward conclusion. Cameras flashed silently outside the courtroom windows. In the gallery, families of victims wept quietly, their bodies trembling with the weight of years spent searching for answers. Derek Vance sat motionless at the defense table, his expression a carefully constructed mask of disinterest, though Marcus noticed his fingers drumming against the table, a tell, a crack in the facade of control. Marcus kept his attention partially on the prosecutor but primarily on Shadow. The dog remained in his down position, but the tension in his body had escalated dramatically. Shadow's breathing had become shallow and rapid, his chest expanding and contracting with increasing urgency. The leash, held loosely in Marcus's hands, suddenly felt alive, as if it were a conduit transmitting the dog's mounting anxiety directly into Marcus's nervous system. Marcus had worked with Shadow for 7 years, had experienced countless deployments and investigations, but he'd never felt the dog vibrate with this particular frequency of alertness. It was different from the usual engagement that came with active detection work. This felt primal. This felt dangerous. The prosecutor continued his opening statement, his words flowing smoothly as he outlined the evidence that would be presented. The defendant left behind DNA evidence at each crime scene, evidence that definitively links him to the murders. We have witnesses who saw him in proximity to the victims. We have forensic evidence, timeline evidence, and crucially, we have the extraordinary tracking abilities of Officer Marcus Chen's K-9 partner, Shadow, who located Derek Vance hidden in a remote location 300 miles from the nearest city. Marcus tried to focus on the words, but Shadow was becoming increasingly difficult to manage. The dog's front paws began to shift restlessly, moving back and forth in micro-movements that suggested contained energy desperately seeking release. Marcus gently placed his hand on Shadow's chest, attempting to communicate calm through touch, but Shadow's heart was hammering beneath his ribs like a war drum signaling imminent battle. The dog's ears had rotated fully backward, focused with laser-like precision on something in the courtroom, but Marcus couldn't determine the exact source of Shadow's attention. Then Marcus noticed something that sent ice cascading down his spine. Shadow's nose had begun twitching with increasingly rapid movements. The dog's nostrils flared open and closed, processing air currents and scent molecules with the intensity of someone trying to decode a critical message. Shadow's eyes, previously locked on Derek Vance, had shifted slightly, now focused on something near the defendant's position but not directly on Vance himself. What was Shadow detecting? What had triggered this extraordinary response? The prosecutor was now displaying photographs of the crime scenes, images that caused gasps throughout the gallery and several jurors to look away in horror. The violence captured in these photographs was stark and brutally real. Women's bodies, trauma, suffering immortalized in digital form. The gallery erupted in emotional reactions, sobs from family members, angry muttering from spectators, the rustle of tissues being withdrawn from purses. Judge Holloway maintained her stern expression, her gaze sweeping across the courtroom to ensure order was maintained. And then it happened. Shadow's entire body went rigid. Every muscle contracted simultaneously, as if the dog had been struck by an invisible electric current. His ears snapped to full attention, pointing backward with such force that Marcus could almost hear the cartilage shifting. Shadow's mouth opened, and his chest expanded dramatically, drawing in air with such intensity that everyone within 5 feet heard the sharp intake of breath. For a millisecond, just one frozen moment in time, there was absolute silence in the courtroom, as if everyone sensed that something fundamental was about to shift. Then Shadow barked. But this wasn't an ordinary bark. This wasn't the friendly vocalization of a dog greeting someone. This wasn't the alert signal that came with routine detection work. This was primal. This was desperate. This was a warning cry that seemed to originate from somewhere ancient within the dog's genetic code. The bark echoed through the courtroom with visceral power, reverberating off marble walls and bouncing through the high ceilings. Woof! The sound was so sudden, so explosive, that several jurors jumped in their seats. One woman gripped the armrest of her chair as if bracing for impact. Marcus jerked the leash hard, his face immediately flushing crimson with embarrassment. "Shadow, no," he commanded, his voice sharp with the tone he reserved for corrections. But Shadow wasn't finished. The dog barked again, and this time the vocalization was even more intense, more desperate. Woof! Woof! The leash strained violently against Marcus's hands, the leather cutting into his palms as Shadow lunged forward with surprising strength. Judge Holloway's gavel came down with thunderous force. "Order, order in my courtroom," she glared at Marcus with an expression that combined fury with confusion. The prosecutor stopped mid-sentence, his opening statement abruptly derailed. The gallery erupted into chaos. Spectators stood, craning their necks to see what was happening. Reporters shouted questions. Cameras flashed with increased frequency. Court officers moved forward, ready to intervene. But Shadow wasn't attacking anyone. The dog wasn't lunging at Derek Vance or any other person in the courtroom. Instead, Shadow remained focused on a specific location, directly at the defendant's position, but slightly offset, near the bench where Vance sat. His barks continued, unrelenting, desperate, as if the dog was attempting to communicate something absolutely critical through the only language available to him. Marcus pulled harder on the leash, his arms straining with effort, his face burning with humiliation. "I'm so sorry, Your Honor," Marcus began, his voice cracking with embarrassment. "I don't know what Shadow has never," but Shadow barked again, cutting off his words. The dog's intensity hadn't diminished at all. If anything, it had escalated. Shadow's entire body was trembling now, muscles quivering with contained urgency. Judge Holloway stood from her elevated position, her expression transforming from anger to something else, something that resembled dawning realization. She stared at Shadow with an intensity that matched the dog's focus. Her eyes narrowed as she processed what she was witnessing. Something about Shadow's behavior, something about the dog's singular focus and desperate vocalization, had triggered a shift in her understanding. "Officer Chen," Judge Holloway said, her voice cutting through the chaos like a knife through silk, "what precisely is your dog alerting to?" Marcus felt his stomach drop. In his 7 years working with Shadow in hundreds of investigations and trials, the dog had never behaved this way, never barked uncontrollably, never lost composure. Shadow was legendary for his calm, his professionalism, his ability to maintain focus under the most intense circumstances. But something in this courtroom, something invisible to human senses, had triggered every instinct Shadow possessed. I'm not certain, Your Honor," Marcus responded, and the admission hung in the air like a confession of failure. Judge Holloway's expression hardened with determination. She looked directly at the bailiff. "Clear this courtroom. Now. Everyone except essential personnel out. And someone tell me," she continued, her gaze returning to Shadow, "what exactly was this dog trained to detect before his current assignment?" The question hung in the air like a guillotine suspended above a condemned man's neck. And as Marcus met the judge's penetrating stare, he realized that whatever was about to unfold would fundamentally alter the trajectory of this trial, and possibly much more. The courtroom emptied with surprising efficiency. Judge Holloway had issued orders with the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience, and her marshals responded with military precision. Spectators were ushered toward the exits, their protests and questions falling on deaf ears. The media representatives protested vehemently, understanding that they were being excluded from what promised to be a pivotal moment in the trial, but Judge Holloway's expression brooked no argument. Within minutes, The gallery had transformed from a packed auditorium into a sparse chamber containing only essential personnel. The judge, her court officers, Marcus, Shadow, Derek Vance and his defense attorney, the prosecutor, and a handful of security personnel stationed strategically throughout the room. Derek Vance's demeanor had changed dramatically. His mask of disinterested composure had cracked, revealing something beneath, something that resembled anxiety mixed with barely suppressed rage. His fingers, which had been drumming rhythmically against the defense table, now clenched into white-knuckled fists. His jaw worked silently, as if grinding through words he refused to speak. Most tellingly, his eyes tracked Shadow's movements with an intensity that confirmed what Marcus was beginning to suspect. Vance knew exactly what Shadow had detected. Whatever it was, whatever invisible threat hung in the air of this courtroom, Derek Vance was intimately familiar with it. Judge Holloway descended from her elevated bench with measured steps, her robes flowing behind her like a dark cloak of authority. She approached Marcus and Shadow directly, her stern face unreadable but her eyes alive with questions that demanded immediate answers. "Officer Chen," she began, her voice lower now but no less commanding, "in my 27 years presiding over federal cases, I have observed many courtroom incidents. But I have never witnessed a K9 of Shadow's reputation exhibit such behavior. This dog has been in this courtroom twice already during preliminary hearings. He remained calm both times, so something has changed. Something specific about this moment, this trial, or this defendant has triggered a response that transcends normal canine behavior." Marcus felt sweat trickling down his temples despite the cool air conditioning of the courthouse. His hands remained firm on Shadow's leash, feeling the dog's continued trembling, the persistent tension that hadn't diminished despite the courtroom being cleared of spectators. Shadow's breathing remained rapid and shallow, and his nose continued its persistent twitching, processing scent molecules with focused intensity. The dog's eyes never wavered from Derek Vance's position. "Your Honor," Marcus began carefully, choosing his words with precision, "Shadow was originally certified in dual detection, narcotics and explosives detection during his first 3 years of K9 service. That was 7 years ago. He's been reassigned to evidence tracking and criminal apprehension for the past 4 years. His detection certifications lapsed years ago, and he hasn't actively engaged in detection work during deployment since his reassignment." However, Marcus paused, understanding the implications of what he was about to say. His training doesn't simply vanish. A dog's olfactory memory is permanent. Once trained to detect a substance, they retain that ability indefinitely. Judge Holloway's eyes widened fractionally, a subtle shift in expression that revealed she'd grasped the significance immediately. "You're telling me," she said slowly, carefully, "that despite his reassignment, Shadow is currently alerting to either narcotics or explosives in my courtroom." The words hung in the air like a sentence of death. The implications exploded across Marcus's consciousness like a detonation, an explosive device, hidden somewhere in this federal courthouse, during a high-profile trial of a serial killer. The security nightmare was almost incomprehensible to contemplate. "That's possible, Your Honor," Marcus admitted, his voice emerging quieter than he intended. "I can't be certain of what he's detecting without conducting a controlled assessment, but his behavior is consistent with his trained alert signals from years ago. His body language, the intensity of his focus, the desperate nature of his barking, these are all indicators that he's detected something he was trained to warn about." Derek Vance stood abruptly, his chair scraping backward with a violent screech. "This is bullshit," he shouted, his controlled demeanor completely obliterated. "This is a setup. That dog is reacting to," but one of the court officers moved forward with hand raised, and Vance fell silent, though his chest heaved with barely suppressed fury. Judge Holloway turned to face the defendant, her expression transformative, shifting from stern jurist to something more dangerous. "Mr. Vance, your reaction is noted," she said coolly. "Your attorney may advise you that remaining silent at this juncture would be prudent. She turned back to Marcus. "Officer Chen, I need you to tell me precisely what Shadow was trained to detect. Every substance, every compound, every material. I need detailed information about his alert signals and his accuracy rate during his detection work." Marcus took a deep breath, organizing his thoughts. Shadow was trained to detect cocaine, methamphetamine, heroin, and fentanyl. His narcotics detection accuracy was documented at 99.8%. For explosives, he was trained to detect military-grade explosives including C4, TNT, RDX, and commercial blasting agents. His explosive detection accuracy was equally high. His alert signal involved an initial bark followed by focus staring at the source, which is exactly what we're witnessing now. So he could be alerting to either narcotics or explosives, Judge Holloway concluded, her mind clearly processing the multiplying complications. Which is a significant problem regardless of which one it is. An explosive device in my courtroom during a capital trial would constitute an attempt at interference with federal justice proceedings. Narcotics would be a security breach and potentially evidence of criminal activity. She turned to her bailiff. "Contact the FBI's bomb detection unit and the Drug Enforcement Administration immediately. Tell them we have a potential situation at the courthouse. No panic, no public notification. Just get them here quietly and quickly. And get someone from courthouse security in here to explain how this situation could possibly have occurred." The bailiff immediately moved toward the phone, his movements efficient and practiced. Judge Holloway then turned to address the entire courtroom assembly. "From this moment forward, this trial is in recess. No one leaves this courtroom except authorized personnel conducting the assessment. Derek Vance will be returned to his holding cell with reinforced security. This defendant's demeanor and his reaction to this dog's alert suggests he has knowledge relevant to whatever Shadow has detected." She turned back to Marcus, her gaze penetrating. "Officer Chen, I'm placing Shadow under temporary federal authority. With your cooperation, we're going to conduct a detailed assessment of this courtroom. Shadow will identify the precise location and nature of whatever he's detecting. Your dog may have just prevented a catastrophic incident. I want you to understand the gravity of this situation. If there is indeed an explosive device or significant quantity of contraband in my courtroom, the implications are staggering." Marcus nodded, his throat dry. He'd never imagined this scenario. He'd brought Shadow to court to serve as evidence in a prosecution, never considering that his partner might detect something else entirely, something that transcended the trial and implicated the very integrity of the federal justice system. "Your Honor," the defense attorney began, standing with obvious confusion, "I must protest this irregular proceeding. This dog's behavior could be misinterpreted, could be influenced by—" "Sit down," Judge Holloway commanded without even glancing at the attorney. "Your client's reaction to this dog's alert speaks volumes. We will conduct a thorough investigation, and if nothing is found, we will reconvene trial and proceed. But if something is found, your client's reaction will be admissible evidence of consciousness of guilt." Shadow pressed against Marcus's leg, and Marcus felt the dog's trembling intensifying. Shadow knew something was wrong. The dog's instincts had been screaming warnings all week: the restlessness, the refusal to eat, the heightened alertness. Shadow had been trying to communicate a critical threat, and now, finally, humans were beginning to listen. The federal courthouse, once a symbol of justice and order, had transformed into a potential crime scene. And Shadow, a dog whose training supposedly lapsed 4 years ago, had inadvertently exposed a threat that could have decimated the federal judicial system. Judge Holloway picked up her phone, her jaw set with determination. "Get me the FBI field office director. Now." FBI's hazardous devices team arrived at the federal courthouse within 47 minutes, their specialized equipment and trained personnel transforming the building into a controlled investigation site. Special Agent Robert Morrison, the team leader, was a grizzled veteran with 23 years of experience in explosive detection and defusal. He dismantled 74 improvised explosive devices during his career, and his calm demeanor reflected someone who looked into the abyss of human destructiveness and refused to flinch. His team moved with practiced efficiency, establishing a perimeter around the courtroom and implementing protocols that would prevent any potential detonation from causing catastrophic damage to the building's structural integrity. Marcus remained in Judge Holloway's private chambers with Shadow, watching through a video monitor as FBI technicians meticulously scanned the courtroom with sophisticated equipment. They used metal detectors, thermal imaging devices, and advanced chemical detection instruments that looked like something from a science fiction film. The technology hummed and clicked, processing data at speeds that would have been impossible a decade earlier. But as the minutes stretched into what felt like hours, a troubling reality emerged. The electronic detection equipment was finding nothing. Special Agent Morrison's voice crackled through the courthouse's internal communication system. "Judge Holloway, our initial sweep is showing negative results. No metallic components consistent with explosive devices. No chemical signatures matching known military-grade explosives or commercial blasting agents. The equipment is functioning properly. There's simply nothing here." Marcus felt his stomach clench with anxiety. What if he'd made a terrible mistake? What if Shadow's alert was a false positive? What if years of retirement from active detection work had somehow corrupted the dog's reliability? The implications were devastating to consider. A famous K-9 whose alert had triggered a federal investigation, disrupted a capital trial, and potentially embarrassed the entire law enforcement community could have his career, and Marcus's credibility, destroyed by a single erroneous detection. Judge Holloway's expression remained unreadable as she observed the proceedings through the monitor. "Special Agent Morrison," she said into the phone, "I understand your findings, but I must insist on a more thorough investigation. This dog's accuracy record is exceptional. His alert was unmistakable and desperate. I want a manual search conducted by trained personnel. I want every seat examined, every corner inspected. I want this courtroom dissected." There was a pause, then Morrison's voice returned, slightly colored with skepticism but professional in tone. "Understood, Your Honor. We'll conduct a comprehensive manual search. It will take time, but we'll be thorough." Marcus watched the screen as FBI technicians began physically removing seat cushions, examining the space beneath courthouse benches, checking the underside of tables, and methodically processing every cubic inch of the courtroom environment. Shadow, lying beside Marcus in the chambers, remained alert, his body still vibrating with that persistent tension. The dog's nose continued its subtle twitching, and Marcus realized something significant. Shadow wasn't relaxing. If there was nothing to detect, wouldn't the dog have calmed down? Wouldn't his alert have subsided once he'd communicated the warning? 2 hours into the manual search, one of the FBI technicians called out urgently, "We've got something. North corner beneath the witness stand, there's a compartment." The video feed shifted as camera operators redirected their attention to the northwestern corner of the courtroom. What became visible was shocking. A carefully constructed false panel beneath the witness stand, expertly concealed with matching wood grain and seamlessly integrated into the courtroom's architectural design. It was the kind of hiding place that would require intimate knowledge of the building's construction or access to architectural blueprints. Special Agent Morrison approached the compartment with extreme caution, his movements deliberate and controlled. He used specialized tools to open the panel without disturbing whatever might be inside. The camera angle shifted again, providing a clearer view of the interior space. What emerged from that compartment was not explosives. It was far worse. Inside were 3 vacuum-sealed packages containing what appeared to be crystal-like substances. Even through the video monitor, Marcus could see the distinctive appearance of methamphetamine, high-purity product that suggested professional synthesis and distribution. Beside the drugs were several items that made Marcus's blood run cold. A burner phone, a small notebook, electronic components that resembled remote detonation circuitry, and a handwritten list of names that appeared to be written in code. Special Agent Morrison's voice emerged over the communication system. His earlier skepticism completely evaporated. "Your Honor, we have a significant find. We're looking at approximately 3 kilograms of methamphetamine, sophisticated communication equipment, and components that suggest someone has been planning something beyond simple drug distribution. The components include materials consistent with remote detonation circuitry." The implications cascaded through Marcus's consciousness like an avalanche. Shadow hadn't been detecting explosive material because there was no explosive material present. Yet, the remote detonation circuitry suggested that explosives could be introduced to the compartment at a later time. But more critically, Shadow had detected the narcotics, the methamphetamine, which he'd been trained to alert to years ago. The dog's instincts had transcended his current assignment and identified a criminal threat that was actively present in the courtroom. Judge Holloway stood abruptly, her expression transforming into something more intense than before. "Special Agent Morrison, I want that entire compartment processed as evidence, and I want to know immediately who constructed that compartment, how long has it been there, and most importantly, what is Derek Vance's connection to this discovery?" Marcus watched as FBI technicians carefully photographed the compartment and its contents, establishing chain of custody for evidence that would likely become central to a new criminal investigation. The prosecution's case against Vance, already strong with the DNA evidence and forensic documentation, had just been fundamentally complicated by this discovery. Derek Vance was brought back into the courtroom under heavy security. His demeanor had completely transformed. The controlled, disinterested facade had shattered entirely, replaced by barely suppressed panic. His eyes darted repeatedly toward the exposed compartment beneath the witness stand, and his entire body trembled with what appeared to be rage mixed with desperation. "That's not mine," he shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "I don't know anything about that. Someone planted it. This is a setup. This is." "Silence," Judge Holloway commanded, her voice cutting through his protests like a blade. "Mr. Vance, your reaction to this discovery is noted. Your attorney has advised you of your right to remain silent, and I suggest you exercise that right immediately. We will determine your connection to these items through forensic analysis and investigation." She turned to Special Agent Morrison. "I want fingerprints analyzed immediately. I want to know whose DNA is on those packages, and I want someone to explain to me how 3 kilograms of methamphetamine and bomb-making components ended up hidden in my courtroom." Marcus remained in the chambers, watching this unfold, his mind reeling with the magnitude of what had occurred. Shadow had done something extraordinary. He detected a criminal conspiracy that transcended the original murder trial. The dog had identified contraband that suggested a nexus between drug distribution and potential violence. Shadow's alert had revealed a web of criminality that was far more complex than anyone had anticipated. A court officer appeared at the chamber's door. "Officer Chen, Judge Holloway requests your presence in the courtroom." Marcus stood, steadying Shadow, and the two of them walked toward the courtroom. As he entered, every eye turned toward him and his remarkable partner. Shadow had stopped a crime before it could fully unfold. Shadow had demonstrated that his training, despite years of dormancy, remained embedded in his very being. Shadow had proven why K-9 units remained invaluable to law enforcement, even when circumstances suggested otherwise. Judge Holloway's expression, as Marcus approached the bench, was one of profound respect mixed with the understanding that the implications of this discovery were only beginning to unfold. "Officer Chen," she said formally, "your dog has just prevented what appears to be a significant criminal operation. The question now becomes, What else was being planned that we've interrupted? Within 6 hours of the discovery, news of Shadow's extraordinary courtroom alert had spread like wildfire through every major news network in the United States. The story was irresistible to media outlets. A heroic K-9, a dramatic courtroom moment, a hidden criminal conspiracy exposed through the remarkable instincts of a dog whose training supposedly had lapsed years ago. Television anchors struggled to contain their excitement as they reported the breaking news. Cable news networks interrupted regularly scheduled programming to provide live updates. The headline was universally consistent. Hero K-9 uncovers drug and bomb plot in federal courthouse. By evening, Shadow's photograph was appearing on screens across the country. Media outlets had obtained images of the German Shepherd from the police department's K-9 unit files, and those photographs were being broadcast alongside dramatic courtroom sketches and footage of federal agents conducting their investigation. Shadow, entirely unaware of his sudden celebrity status, simply wanted dinner and his favorite toy, a rubber Kong that squeaked when pressed. But Marcus knew that everything had changed in an instant. His partner had transitioned from a respected K-9 with an impressive track record to a national symbol of law enforcement excellence and unwavering loyalty. The police commissioner called Marcus directly, his voice conveying a mixture of pride and administrative urgency. "Officer Chen, you and Shadow have performed an extraordinary service to this nation. What you've uncovered at that courthouse appears to be part of a much larger criminal enterprise. I'm authorizing immediate commendations for both you and Shadow. The mayor wants to meet with you both. The governor's office has already called inquiring about a public recognition ceremony." "This is bigger than I initially anticipated." Marcus sat in his apartment, his phone pressed against his ear, barely comprehending the magnitude of what was unfolding. "Sir, I appreciate that, but honestly, I was as surprised as everyone else by Shadow's alert. I brought him to court as evidence in the Vance trial. The fact that he detected something in the compartment was completely unexpected. The real credit belongs to Shadow's training and his instincts." "That may be true," the commissioner replied, "but you're the handler. You worked with that dog every single day. You maintained his conditioning, even though he wasn't actively assigned to detection work. That speaks to your professionalism and your understanding of K-9 capabilities. The public is going to want to meet you both. Prepare yourself for that attention." By the following morning, the attention had intensified exponentially. News vans were parked outside the police department's K-9 facility. Reporters shouted questions whenever anyone in uniform appeared. Local television stations had established permanent positions outside the courthouse, broadcasting live updates about the expanding investigation. Federal authorities were now examining the possibility that the hidden compartment had been constructed as a distribution point for a larger drug trafficking operation. The remote detonation circuitry components suggested that someone had been planning to use violence, potentially explosive force, to protect their criminal enterprise. The FBI's preliminary investigation revealed something deeply disturbing. The compartment beneath the witness stand had been constructed approximately 8 months earlier, long before Derek Vance's arrest. This meant that someone else had placed it there, someone with intimate knowledge of the courthouse's architecture, and someone with access to the building. Federal investigators launched a massive inquiry into courthouse personnel, examining maintenance workers, custodial staff, security officers, and administrative employees. Every person who'd had access to the building during the relevant time frame became a potential suspect. Derek Vance, facing intensifying scrutiny, finally broke his silence. Through his attorney, he provided information that shocked investigators. Vance admitted that he'd been in contact with members of a methamphetamine distribution network, but he claimed he had no knowledge of the compartment or its contents. However, his communications revealed something else entirely. Vance had been providing information to drug traffickers about courtroom proceedings and security protocols. He'd been paid substantial sums of money to act as an informant, feeding crucial intelligence to criminals about ongoing federal cases. This revelation transformed the investigation into something far more complex. Vance wasn't just a serial killer. He was a corrupt defendant potentially involved with organized crime. The methamphetamine discovery wasn't incidental to his case. It was central to a much larger criminal conspiracy. Federal prosecutors began considering additional charges against Vance, including conspiracy to distribute controlled substances and providing material support to criminal enterprises. Local television stations ran segments featuring Shadow's story. One anchor interviewed Dr. Elena Vasquez, a renowned K-9 behavioral expert from the FBI's training facility. What we're witnessing with Shadow is a remarkable example of canine neuroplasticity and olfactory memory, Dr. Vasquez explained on camera. Dogs don't simply forget their training. Their brains are wired differently from human brains. A scent signature they've been trained to detect remains encoded in their neural pathways permanently. Shadow may have been reassigned to evidence tracking work, but his nose never forgot what he'd been trained to identify. When he encountered the methamphetamine in that courtroom, his brain recognized the scent and triggered his alert response, the same response he'd been trained to perform years earlier. The explanation provided scientific credibility to what had otherwise seemed almost miraculous. Shadow wasn't operating on supernatural instinct or cosmic coincidence. He was demonstrating the remarkable biological capabilities that made K-9 units invaluable to law enforcement. His nose contained approximately 300 million olfactory receptors, compared to the human nose's approximately 6 million receptors. His ability to distinguish individual scent molecules was literally millions of times more sensitive than human capabilities. Shadow wasn't exceptional because of magic. He was exceptional because he was a dog. The police department received thousands of supportive messages from citizens across the country. People sent gifts for Shadow, premium dog treats, custom collars, specially designed beds with his name embroidered. Animal rights organizations praised the K-9 unit for maintaining Shadow's training and fitness. Dog training facilities requested permission to use Shadow's story in their promotional materials and training protocols. Universities studying criminal justice, law enforcement, and canine behavior requested interviews with Marcus about his partnership with Shadow. Judge Holloway issued a formal statement from the federal courthouse. Officer Marcus Chen's K-9 partner, Shadow, has demonstrated the profound value that trained animals bring to the judicial system and law enforcement generally. This dog's alert prevented a significant criminal operation from proceeding undetected. The courage and dedication displayed by both officer and K-9 exemplify the highest standards of public service. Shadow's actions will serve as a reminder to all of us about the importance of maintaining rigorous training standards and respecting the extraordinary capabilities of our law enforcement partners. The mayor's office scheduled a public recognition ceremony for the following week. Shadow would receive the city's highest civilian honor for service to the community. Marcus would be presented with a commendation for his professionalism and his maintenance of Shadow's training despite the dog's reassignment to different work. The ceremony would be televised, and media outlets promised comprehensive coverage. But amid all the celebration and recognition, Marcus found himself reflecting on the deeper implications of what had occurred. Shadow's alert had prevented a potential tragedy. If the compartment had contained explosives that were later detonated in the courtroom, the loss of life would have been catastrophic. Federal judges, prosecutors, jurors, court officers, and innocent observers could have been murdered. Shadow had unknowingly stood as a guardian between civilization and chaos. Federal investigators continued their work, following the threads of the conspiracy deeper into the criminal underworld. They discovered that the compartment had been constructed by a maintenance worker named Thomas Riley, a man with deep connections to methamphetamine distribution networks. Riley had been paid $50,000 to construct the hiding place, and maintain it as a distribution point. He'd been arrested at his home, where investigators found additional quantities of methamphetamine and sophisticated communication equipment. The investigation expanded further, revealing connections between Riley, Derek Vance, and a larger criminal organization that had been operating across multiple states. Federal prosecutors now faced the complex task of charging multiple defendants with conspiracy, drug distribution, and potential planning for violence. What had begun as a straightforward murder trial had transformed into something far more significant, an exposure of criminal corruption that penetrated the federal courthouse system itself. Marcus watched Shadow sleeping peacefully on his bed, the dog completely unaware of the seismic impact his single moment of alertness had created. Shadow's ears twitched occasionally, as if dreaming of something important. Marcus reflected on those 7 days before the trial when Shadow had exhibited strange behavior, the restlessness, the refusal to eat, the constant vigilance. Shadow's instincts had been screaming warnings about danger approaching. The dog had been preparing himself for a moment when his training would be needed again. That moment had arrived, and Shadow had answered the call with perfect fidelity to his original purpose. Dr. Elena Vasquez sat in her laboratory at the FBI's Behavioral Analysis and Training Center in Quantico, Virginia, surrounded by neuroimaging equipment, brain scans, and extensive research documentation about canine olfactory systems. She'd been contacted by countless media outlets requesting interviews, but she'd agreed to speak with Marcus and Judge Holloway in a private setting to provide detailed scientific context for Shadow's extraordinary performance. The meeting took place in a secure conference room, with Shadow present but relaxed, completely unbothered by the sophisticated equipment surrounding him. Dr. Vasquez, a woman in her mid-50s with steel-gray hair and piercing blue eyes, had dedicated her entire career to understanding the neurobiological foundations of canine capabilities. She'd published 17 peer-reviewed papers on canine olfactory memory, consulted with law enforcement agencies across 6 continents, and had personally certified more than 500 detection dogs during her career. Her credentials were impeccable, her expertise unquestionable, and her passion for understanding the remarkable abilities of working dogs was evident in every word she spoke. What we're observing with Shadow is a textbook example of olfactory memory encoding, Dr. Vasquez began, pulling up brain scans on a large display monitor. When a dog is trained to detect a specific substance, in Shadow's case, methamphetamine during his original detection certification, the experience creates permanent neural pathways. These pathways don't deteriorate over time the way human memories sometimes do. Instead, they remain essentially unchanging throughout the dog's life. She gestured toward the brain scans. This is a comparison between Shadow's current brain structure and the brain structure of dogs who have never received detection training. Notice the significantly more developed regions in Shadow's olfactory cortex, the area responsible for processing and interpreting scent information. Shadow's brain has been literally restructured by his training. His neural architecture is different from a non-detection dog. That difference is permanent. Marcus leaned forward, fascinated by the scientific underpinning of what he'd always understood intuitively about his partner. But Shadow hadn't been actively doing detection work for 4 years, Marcus said. Wouldn't his capabilities atrophy? That's a common misconception, Dr. Vasquez replied, her expression indicating she'd addressed this question countless times before. Physical capabilities can atrophy. A dog's musculature, endurance, or agility can deteriorate without regular exercise. But olfactory capabilities don't work that way. The neural pathways remain intact. The dog's nose doesn't forget. In fact, in Shadow's case, we could argue that his abilities may have actually sharpened. She pulled up additional data. Shadow was reassigned to tracking and evidence work, correct? That work still engaged his olfactory system, just in different ways. He was tracking human scent, identifying specific individuals through smell, and processing complex scent signatures. That continued engagement kept his entire olfactory processing system active and functioning at high capacity. When he encountered the methamphetamine in that courtroom, his brain recognized a scent signature it had been trained to identify years earlier, and his instinctive alert response activated. Judge Holloway, observing this explanation, nodded slowly. So Shadow's reassignment to different work actually maintained his detection capabilities in a state of readiness. Precisely, Dr. Vasquez confirmed. It's comparable to a musician who stops actively performing but continues listening to music and maintaining an instrument. The fundamental skills don't disappear. When the opportunity to perform comes, the neural networks are still there, ready to activate. She turned to address Shadow directly, her tone becoming almost reverent. Shadow, what you demonstrated in that courtroom wasn't a fluke. It wasn't a lucky guess. It was the culmination of your training expressing itself through your biological capabilities. Your nose is literally 1,000,000 times more sensitive than a human nose for detecting specific scent molecules. When you encountered that methamphetamine, every receptor in your olfactory system screamed recognition. Shadow, sensing the positive attention, wagged his tail and pressed his head against Marcus's leg. The dog had no comprehension of the scientific analysis occurring around him, but he responded to the tone of approval and affection being directed toward him. Dr. Vasquez continued her presentation, pulling up research on the specific mechanics of how Shadow would have detected the methamphetamine. Methamphetamine, like all substances, is volatile. It releases scent molecules into the surrounding air continuously. Those molecules diffuse through the air, settling on surfaces, penetrating materials, creating what we call a scent cone around the source location. Shadow would have detected that scent cone the moment he entered the courtroom. She displayed a three-dimensional visualization of how scent molecules dispersed from the compartment beneath the witness stand. The compartment was sealed with vacuum-sealed packaging, but no seal is perfect. Microscopic amounts of scent molecules were escaping, dispersing through the courtroom air. To Shadow's olfactory system, it would have been like seeing a spotlight in a dark room. The signal was unmistakable. The source was obvious. Judge Holloway studied the visualization intently, so Shadow knew the location of the compartment with precision. Absolutely, Dr. Vasquez affirmed. Notice how Shadow's alert behavior was focused. He wasn't generally agitated. He was specifically oriented toward the location where the compartment was hidden. His barking was directed at a precise point in space. Shadow knew exactly where the contraband was located. Marcus recalled the precise angle of Shadow's gaze during the courtroom alert. He was staring directly at the space where we found the compartment. Precisely, Dr. Vasquez said. Shadow's nose had triangulated the source location. His brain had processed the scent signature, recognized it as methamphetamine, and identified the exact spatial coordinates of the source. He communicated all of that information through his alert behavior. She pulled up additional research. What's particularly fascinating about Shadow's case is the temporal element. Officer Chen mentioned that Shadow had been exhibiting unusual behavior for approximately 7 days before the trial. Heightened alertness, restlessness, refusal to eat. That suggests Shadow's olfactory system had detected the presence of the methamphetamine in the courtroom or its immediate vicinity before the trial date. Shadow had been processing that information at a subconscious level, exhibiting behavioral changes that reflected his system's detection of something unusual or threatening. Marcus felt a profound realization crystallizing in his mind. Shadow's behavior during the week before trial hadn't been random nervousness or illness. The dog had been detecting the methamphetamine and trying to communicate that detection through behavioral signals. Shadow's restlessness, his lack of appetite, his constant vigilance, these weren't symptoms of physical illness or emotional distress. They were the manifestations of a detection dog who'd identified a threat and was attempting to alert his handler. So Shadow was trying to warn me, Marcus said quietly, understanding flooding through him. All week he was trying to tell me something was wrong, something dangerous was present. Almost certainly, Dr. Vasquez confirmed, her expression compassionate. Dogs communicate through behavior. Shadow was exhibiting classic stress signals: inability to settle, lack of appetite, heightened alertness. These are all behavioral indicators that a dog's sensory system has identified something requiring attention. You brought Shadow to the location where the threat was present, his system fully activated and prepared, and when you entered the courtroom, his alert response was immediate and unmistakable. Judge Holloway stood and approached Shadow, extending her hand for the dog to sniff. Shadow accepted the gesture with his characteristic gentle demeanor. "This dog," Judge Holloway said quietly, "essentially protected my courtroom, the jurors, the attorneys, and everyone present by identifying a criminal threat that human technology and security protocols had failed to detect. That's extraordinary." Dr. Vasquez nodded. "It's a humbling reminder of why we continue to employ K9 units despite advancing technology. No machine we've developed approaches the sophistication of a dog's olfactory system. Shadow's nose detected what metal detectors couldn't identify, what thermal imaging missed, what electronic sensors failed to register. Only a dog's biological capabilities could accomplish that detection." She turned to Marcus with professional admiration evident in her expression. "Officer Chen, you should be aware that your handler training directly contributed to this outcome. You maintained Shadow's physical conditioning despite his reassignment. You continued to engage with him in ways that kept his sensory systems active. You recognized that his behavior change before the trial was significant enough to warrant veterinary evaluation. Your attentiveness to Shadow's needs and capabilities created the conditions where his training could re-emerge at precisely the moment it was needed." Marcus felt humbled by the recognition. He'd simply been doing his job, caring for his partner as he always had. He'd never imagined that his consistent, attentive care would result in preventing a criminal conspiracy. "The broader implication," Dr. Vasquez continued, addressing both Marcus and Judge Holloway, "is that K9 units represent an irreplaceable component of law enforcement capabilities. Shadow's performance demonstrates that properly trained and maintained detection dogs remain valuable assets throughout their careers, even when their official assignments change. Departments should consider rotating dogs through multiple types of work: detection, tracking, apprehension, evidence work, to maintain their overall capabilities while preventing the kind of specialized burnout that can affect dogs assigned to a single task for their entire careers." She concluded her presentation with a final thought. Shadow didn't do anything extraordinary in the sense of performing beyond his capabilities. He did exactly what he was trained to do, what his biological systems are designed to accomplish. What's extraordinary is that we have the capacity to develop such remarkable partnerships between humans and animals. Shadow represents the best of what law enforcement can achieve when we honor the unique contributions that animals make to our work. As the meeting concluded, Shadow stood and stretched, completely oblivious to the profound scientific analysis that had been conducted regarding his remarkable nose. The dog simply wanted to go home, have dinner, and rest. But his legacy was already being written into law enforcement history. The story of a dog whose training never failed, whose instincts never wavered, and whose loyalty transcended the boundaries of assigned work or time passed since formal certification. Shadow had proven something fundamental. A trained dog's capabilities, once embedded in their neurobiology, remained permanently ready to serve. The federal courthouse became a nexus of intensive criminal investigation as federal prosecutors, FBI agents, and DEA operatives coordinated one of the most complex cases in recent memory. Derek Vance's original trial for serial murder became secondary to the expanding investigation into the criminal conspiracy he'd been part of. Vance's communications with the methamphetamine distribution network were analyzed in granular detail, revealing a sophisticated operation that extended far beyond the simple drug trafficking that had initially appeared obvious. Federal investigators discovered that Vance had been receiving payments, substantial payments, approximately $50,000 per month, in exchange for providing crucial intelligence about ongoing federal cases. His role as a high-security inmate hadn't prevented him from maintaining contact with criminal associates through contraband cell phones and coded communications. More troublingly, his information had directly contributed to the obstruction of justice in at least 7 other federal cases. Witnesses had been intimidated, evidence had been compromised, trials had been delayed or derailed. Derek Vance wasn't just a murderer, he was a systematic saboteur of the federal judicial system itself. Thomas Riley, the courthouse maintenance worker who constructed the hidden compartment, provided testimony that transformed the investigation into something approaching the dimensions of organized crime. Riley admitted that he'd been recruited into the distribution network through an intermediary and had been paid not only to construct the compartment, but to maintain it as a distribution point for moving methamphetamine through the federal courthouse. The revelation that drugs were being distributed from within a federal building created a security nightmare that reverberated through every level of law enforcement and judicial administration. We're looking at a systematic corruption of institutional integrity, Assistant U.S. Attorney James Richardson explained during a press conference outside the courthouse. Derek Vance wasn't acting alone. He was part of a criminal enterprise that had penetrated federal institutions, suborned public employees, and systematically undermined the rule of law. The discovery made possible by the remarkable alert from Officer Chen's K-9 partner, Shadow, prevented the expansion of this conspiracy. Federal investigators traced the distribution network through dozens of electronic communications, financial transactions, and informant testimony. They discovered that the criminal organization had been operating across 5 states, distributing more than 100 kilograms of methamphetamine monthly. The organization's leadership, a man named Victor Castellano, who operated from a secured compound outside Denver, Colorado, had established a sophisticated operation that utilized corruption of public officials as a central strategy. Castellano had identified federal judges, prosecutors, law enforcement officers, and institutional employees who were vulnerable to recruitment, individuals with financial difficulties, substance abuse issues, or personal vulnerabilities that could be exploited. His operation had successfully corrupted at least 19 individuals, creating a network of informants and obstructionists within the federal system itself. The courthouse compartment was just one piece of a much larger infrastructure designed to facilitate criminal activity while compromising law enforcement's ability to respond effectively. The implications were staggering. Federal prosecutors began questioning whether previous cases had been compromised by Vance's interference. Evidence from a dozen prior trials was re-examined to determine if Vance's information had contributed to investigative failures or prosecutorial challenges. Several previously convicted defendants filed appeals based on claims that their trials had been compromised by institutional corruption. The judicial system found itself in an unprecedented position, essentially conducting an autopsy of its own integrity. Derek Vance, realizing that his original murder charges would now be supplemented by federal conspiracy charges, money laundering charges, conspiracy to distribute controlled substances, and multiple counts of obstruction of justice, finally agreed to cooperate with federal prosecutors. His cooperation, negotiated through his attorney, provided federal agents with the road map they needed to systematically dismantle the entire criminal organization. Vance revealed that Victor Castellano had been planning to expand the operation dramatically. The remote detonation circuitry components discovered in the courthouse compartment weren't meant to detonate explosives in the courtroom, at least not immediately. Instead, They were part of a larger plan to manufacture explosive devices that would be strategically placed in federal buildings nationwide. The explosives would serve multiple purposes. They would eliminate federal judges and prosecutors who posed threats to the organization's operations, create widespread fear that would make witnesses reluctant to testify, and destabilize the federal judicial system to the point where the organization could operate with relative impunity. The plot, according to Vance's testimony, was approximately 6 months away from implementation when Shadow's courtroom alert disrupted the timeline. Federal investigators, armed with Vance's detailed testimony and the evidence from the courthouse compartment, launched coordinated raids across multiple states. Within 48 hours, they'd arrested 43 individuals connected to the criminal organization, including Victor Castellano himself. Castellano's residence in Denver was a fortress of criminal infrastructure. Investigators discovered a laboratory where methamphetamine was being synthesized, storage facilities containing more than 200 kilograms of finished product, and a war room where the organization's leaders coordinated operations across multiple states. More alarmingly, they discovered detailed plans for the explosive devices, including blueprints of federal buildings, calculated blast radiuses, and lists of specific targets, judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officers whose removal would benefit the organization's operations. Without that dog's alert, FBI Director Sarah Mitchell stated during a congressional briefing, we would have been dealing with a catastrophic attack on the federal judicial system. Multiple federal buildings would have been targeted. Dozens of federal officials would have been assassinated. The plot was sophisticated, well-funded, and within months of implementation. 1K9's remarkable sensory capabilities prevented what would have been an unprecedented attack on American justice institutions. The scale of the conspiracy became increasingly clear as investigation progressed. The organization had been planning this expansion for years, methodically positioning people and resources. They'd cultivated relationships with corrupt officials, accumulated substantial financial resources, and developed operational capabilities that transcended typical drug trafficking enterprises. This was criminal enterprise operating at the level of organized crime syndicates, sophisticated, patient, and strategically focused. Derek Vance received consecutive life sentences for his murders, plus an additional 180 years for his participation in the conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and money laundering. His cooperation with federal prosecutors didn't spare him from significant incarceration. It simply meant he wouldn't receive the death penalty. He would spend the remainder of his life in federal prison, his cooperation ensuring that other members of the conspiracy would also face serious charges and lengthy sentences. Victor Castellano, the organization's leader, was charged with 47 federal counts including drug trafficking, money laundering, conspiracy to commit murder, conspiracy to commit terrorism, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Prosecutors sought the death penalty, arguing that his planning of the explosive attacks constituted an act of domestic terrorism. Castellano's trial would extend over multiple years, becoming a landmark case in federal prosecutorial history. Thomas Riley, the maintenance worker, accepted a plea agreement in exchange for his testimony against higher-level conspirators. He received a 20-year sentence, substantially reduced from what he would have faced without cooperation. His testimony was crucial in establishing the timeline of the compartment's construction and the nature of the conspiracy's infrastructure. As the trials unfolded and the criminal network was systematically dismantled, federal officials repeatedly credited Shadow with preventing catastrophe. The dog had become synonymous with the preservation of institutional integrity, with the power of trained animals to serve beyond the boundaries of normal expectation, with the remarkable capabilities that nature had endowed certain creatures with the ability to accomplish. Shadow, entirely unaware of the magnitude of his impact on federal law enforcement and the judicial system, continued his daily routine. He ate his meals, played with his toys, took long walks with Marcus, and slept peacefully without understanding that his single moment of alertness had prevented organized crime from achieving one of its most ambitious objectives. The federal courthouse eventually reopened for normal operations after an extended closure for security assessments and renovations. The compartment beneath the witness stand was removed entirely, and security protocols were upgraded to include regular K-9 sweeps and enhanced detection procedures. Shadow's photograph was mounted prominently in the courthouse entrance, a permanent reminder of the day that a remarkable dog had stood as the ultimate guardian of American justice. 5 years had passed since that extraordinary day when Shadow's bark had echoed through the federal courthouse and changed the trajectory of American law enforcement history. Officer Marcus Chen stood in the grand ballroom of the National Law Enforcement Academy in Washington, D.C., watching as his 13-year-old partner was formally inducted into the National K-9 Hall of Fame. Shadow's muzzle had grayed considerably over those 5 years, his once jet-black coat now liberally streaked with silver and white. The dog moved more slowly than he once had, his joints occasionally stiff from arthritis that came with advancing age. But his eyes remained alert, his spirit unbowed, and his dignity undiminished by the passage of years. The auditorium was packed beyond capacity. Federal judges, law enforcement officials from across the nation, K-9 handlers, trainers, and civilians who'd been touched by Shadow's extraordinary service filled every seat. News cameras lined the back of the hall, their operators transmitting the ceremony to millions of viewers across the country. Shadow's story had transcended the initial incident and become woven into the fabric of American law enforcement culture, a narrative about the remarkable capabilities of trained animals and the profound partnerships that could form between humans and dogs. The ceremony's master of ceremonies was James Richardson, the same assistant U.S. attorney who'd prosecuted Derek Vance. Richardson had subsequently been promoted to the position of chief federal prosecutor for the Western District, a role he'd earned partly through his handling of the conspiracy case that Shadow's alert had exposed. As Richardson approached the microphone, his expression conveyed genuine emotion at the opportunity to publicly honor the dog who'd played such a crucial role in his most significant prosecution. "Shadow," Richardson began, his voice carrying through the auditorium with practiced conviction, "5 years ago, you did something that transcended your training, your assignment, and even your handler's expectations. You sensed danger that human technology couldn't detect. You identified a criminal conspiracy that had penetrated the highest levels of our judicial institutions. You prevented an attack that would have killed dozens of federal officials and destroyed the confidence of the American people in their justice system." He paused, allowing the weight of those words to settle over the assembly. But what's more remarkable than any individual action is what you represent. You represent the irreplaceable value of animals in law enforcement. You represent the enduring capabilities that training instills in a living being. You represent loyalty that transcends expectation and instinct that serves the greater good. You represent the best of what we can achieve when we honor the unique contributions that animals make to our society. Shadow, sensing the positive attention directed toward him, wagged his tail slowly. The dog had no comprehension of the formal recognition being bestowed upon him, but he responded to the tone of approval and affection radiating from the crowd. Marcus maintained a secure grip on Shadow's leash, his own eyes moistening with emotion as he witnessed his partner receiving the highest honor that law enforcement could bestow. The auditorium erupted in applause that lasted nearly 3 minutes. Federal judges stood in honor. Police officers from across the nation rose to their feet. The ceremony's formality was momentarily overwhelmed by genuine human emotion, recognition of a remarkable creature who'd served with extraordinary fidelity. Over the subsequent years, Shadow's legacy manifested in countless tangible ways. Congress had passed the Shadows Law 3 years after the courthouse incident, mandating enhanced K-9 detection protocols in all federal buildings and establishing funding for expanded K-9 units throughout the federal law enforcement system. The legislation specifically cited Shadow's performance as justification for the expanded investment in detection dogs. Universities across the nation integrated Shadow's case into their criminal justice curricula. Students studying law enforcement, criminal investigation, and administrative procedures learned about the remarkable dog who'd prevented institutional corruption from destroying federal judicial integrity. Psychology programs studied Shadow's behavioral patterns before the courtroom alert, using his case to educate future professionals about recognizing signs of stress and heightened alertness in animals. Veterinary programs featured Shadow's case when discussing the permanent neurobiological impacts of training on canine brain development. K-9 training facilities nationally had been transformed by lessons learned from Shadow's experience. Handlers were trained to maintain the conditioning of detection dogs, even when those dogs were reassigned to different work. Training protocols now emphasize the permanence of olfactory memory and the importance of keeping detection dogs engaged in sensory-rich environments even during non-detection assignments. The principle that had guided Marcus's care of Shadow, that a trained dog's capabilities never truly fade, became foundational doctrine in K-9 handler training programs. Shadow's retirement had been the subject of extensive media coverage 3 years after the courthouse incident. The dog had simply grown too old to maintain the physical demands of active service. Marcus had filed the paperwork for Shadow's official retirement with mixed emotions, pride in his partner's extraordinary career, combined with the bittersweet knowledge that their daily partnership in active law enforcement was ending. The police department had organized a ceremonial retirement celebration attended by hundreds of officers, federal judges, prosecutors, and community members whose lives had been touched by Shadow's service. Shadow had been presented with the Medal of Valor, the department's highest honor. He'd been awarded a lifetime pension, a stipend that would ensure he received premium care and nutrition for the remainder of his life. The ceremony had been broadcast on local television, and Shadow's photograph had appeared in newspapers and magazines nationwide. In his retirement, Shadow had become something of an ambassadorial figure. Police departments across the nation requested Shadow's participation in public education events, community gatherings, and training seminars. Marcus traveled extensively with his aging partner, participating in K-9 awareness programs and speaking about the importance of maintaining rigorous training standards for detection dogs. Shadow's presence at these events invariably drew crowds. People wanted to see the famous dog, to touch him, to express their gratitude for his service to the nation. Schools requested visits from Shadow and Marcus. Children sat in rapt attention as Marcus explained how Shadow's nose worked, how dogs could detect scents that humans couldn't perceive, how training created permanent capabilities in a dog's brain. Shadow, still patient and gentle despite his advancing years, tolerated the children's excited petting and enthusiastic questions. He became, in his retirement, an educator, teaching the next generation about the remarkable abilities of working animals and the importance of respecting and valuing animal partners in service professions. Marcus kept detailed journals of Shadow's life, documenting the dog's daily activities, health considerations, and behavioral observations. These journals became informal archives that K-9 researchers consulted when studying longevity in working dogs, the impacts of aging on detection capabilities, and the psychological aspects of retirement for animals who'd spent their lives in service roles. Marcus's meticulous record-keeping contributed to expanding scientific understanding of how to support aging working dogs through their final years. Shadow's final decline came gradually. At 16 years old, ancient in dog years, the German Shepherd began experiencing the inevitable consequences of time's passage. His hind legs weakened, making climbing stairs increasingly difficult. His hearing diminished, and he sometimes didn't respond to sounds that had once captured his attention. His energy levels dropped, and he spent more time sleeping than awake. But his cognitive faculties remained sharp, and his spirit remained unbroken. When Shadow finally passed away on a quiet evening in March, Marcus was holding him, whispering words of gratitude and love. The dog's passing was not dramatic or traumatic. It was simply the conclusion of a life well lived, a body surrendering to the inevitable ravages of age. Marcus sat with Shadow's still form for hours, reflecting on the remarkable journey they'd shared, the lives they'd touched, the legacy they'd created together. Shadow's funeral was attended by over 2,000 people. Federal judges, law enforcement officers from agencies across the nation, K-9 handlers, trainers, and civilians whose lives had been impacted by Shadow's service came to pay their respects. The ceremony was held at the police academy, and speakers shared stories about Shadow's extraordinary career. Not just the courthouse incident, but the 17 missing persons he'd located, the 19 criminal cases he'd solved, the countless lives he'd saved through his dedicated service. Universities named scholarships after Shadow. The Shadow Memorial Fund for K-9 Excellence provided financial support to students pursuing careers in law enforcement with K-9 units. K-9 training facilities installed monuments featuring Shadow's photograph and bronze plaques commemorating his service. Police departments across the nation established the Shadow Award, an annual honor recognizing exceptional performance by K-9 units in detection work or criminal apprehension. Marcus retired from active law enforcement 2 years after Shadow's passing, unable to work with another partner. He continued his involvement with K-9 training and education, serving as an advisor and consultant to training programs nationwide. He maintained Shadow's memory through speaking engagements, written accounts of their partnership, and collaboration with researchers studying K-9 capabilities and law enforcement applications. On quiet evenings, Marcus would sit in his study and touch Shadow's collar, the leather worn smooth from years of wear, which he kept mounted on his wall as a permanent reminder of his extraordinary partner. He'd reflect on that pivotal moment in the federal courthouse when Shadow's bark had changed everything, when a dog's instincts had served as the ultimate guardian of American justice, when loyalty and training had combined to prevent catastrophe. Shadow had never sought recognition or reward. He'd simply done what his training and his nature had prepared him to do. He'd identified danger and communicated that identification with unwavering fidelity. In doing so, he'd proven something fundamental about the remarkable bonds between humans and animals, about the irreplaceable value of trained companions in service professions, about the extraordinary ways that ordinary moments can become transformative through the presence of an exceptional partner. Shadow's legacy transcended his individual actions. He represented the best of what law enforcement could achieve when it honored the unique capabilities of animals. He represented the permanent impact that training could inscribe on a living being's neurological architecture. He represented loyalty that transcended assignment, duty that transcended time, and service that transcended the boundaries of ordinary expectation. In federal courthouses, police academies, and law enforcement training facilities across America, Shadow's story remained eternally relevant. A narrative about one dog who heard the call of duty and answered with a bark that echoed through history, changing law enforcement forever and proving that heroes sometimes have 4 legs and an unwavering devotion to the humans they serve.